Take it off, now, that's what she said, loud enough for 3 people at the bench nearby to look up and frown. My daughter froze. Her arms were crossed over her sweat-drenched t-shirt, the charity run logo barely visible beneath the damp fabric. Varela Denton, president of our HOA board, leaned in with a clipboard in one hand and a smirk I'd come to associate with her favorite word, violation. She tilted her sunglasses down like she was peering over the edge of a courtroom bench. "This is a family space," she said. "You're violating visual conduct standards. If she doesn't comply, that's an automatic fine. Page 19. Look it up." I didn't need to. I already had. "You mean the clause that was never ratified?" I said, my voice low, measured. "I checked the filing dates this morning. That conduct standard was never legally adopted." Her jaw twitched. "Before I go on, if you're a parent, if you've ever had someone with too much authority try to shame your child in public, subscribe now. I don't care where you're watching from. You need to hear how this ends. I'm Dr. Alden Maris, a child psychologist. I've testified in juvenile court more times than I can count. But this wasn't happening in a courtroom. It was happening in Rowan Green, the supposedly serene park at the center of our gated community. And my daughter Calla, 13, fresh off her first therapy milestone run, was standing there humiliated in front of strangers. Because her damp shirt had the outline of a sports bra beneath it. Calla didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stood there, blinking. That's when I knew Varela Denton hadn't just broken a rule. She'd broken something much harder to fix. The shirt Calla wore was from a nonprofit event my wife helped organize. We've been through some dark chapters with our daughter. Bullying, body shaming, trust fractures. That morning's jog was supposed to be a celebration. Her therapist even called it a milestone. But the moment Varela opened her mouth, all that progress bled into the mulch under Calla's shoes. And that's why I didn't raise my voice. That's why I didn't swing back with emotion. Because people like Varela Denton, people who believe their authority is unquestionable, don't expect resistance from someone like me. And they sure as hell don't expect Isolde Maris, my wife, to be the one filing formal motions by nightfall. Varela turned to the others. "She's been warned. Next time we'll refer to the Committee for Mandatory Conduct Correction." Calla looked at me, silently asking if we could just leave. We did. But I didn't forget what I saw on that clipboard, a pre-filled citation form, our address already written in black ink. She'd been waiting for this moment. That's the thing about Varela. She moves like a spider in sunlight, slow, visible, but always 2 steps ahead. She's been reshaping our HOA bylaws, under the guise of standards alignment for almost 2 years now. Most residents don't notice, not until it affects them. And even then they shrug. It's easier to comply than to challenge, but not this time. That night, I reviewed the HOA's published addendums. That visual conduct clause, it was listed, sure, but it was dated 7 months after the last legally recognized ratification. No community vote, no board quorum, no posting in the common newsletter. In other words, invalid. Varela wasn't just cruel, she was sloppy. And she was about to learn what happens when you try to regulate shame without legal standing. The morning after the gazebo incident, a new notice was pinned to the community board outside the clubhouse, titled Reinforcement of Visual Conduct Standards in Common Areas. It read like policy, but it wasn't. No signatures, no vote history, just language dressed in authority. Beneath it, in smaller font, effective immediately. Applies to all residents regardless of age. I watched 2 parents read it in silence. One gently steered her daughter away. The other checked his phone and kept walking. That's what silence looks like in Byford Trace. Tight mouths, fast steps, eyes forward. I didn't blame them. Our neighborhood was curated to feel timeless. Ivy-draped fences, restored cobblestone, wrought iron benches. But under the surface, it operated like a cold bureaucracy. Most people didn't notice the grip until it closed on them. The grip had closed on us. Varela Denton ran the board like a personal estate. Technically, there were 5 members, but only 2 ever spoke during meetings. The others nodded or cleared their throats. And if Varela wanted something passed, it passed. Whether or not it followed the HOA's founding charter was another matter. I returned home to find Calla still in bed, Her door was cracked. I knocked. She didn't answer, but I saw the t-shirt on her floor, crumpled, damp, like it still remembered what happened. She hadn't spoken much since yesterday. Just a quiet, "I'm tired" the night before, and a forced smile at dinner. I stood there longer than I should have. Then I turned and walked downstairs. The rest of the morning blurred. Coffee, silence, inbox full of clinic reports. But I couldn't focus. Every time I blinked, I saw her. The moment she froze, the way her fingers tightened over the fabric. I couldn't shake the thought. What if that had been someone else's daughter? Someone who didn't have a civil rights attorney for a mother? What if they believed Varela had the right? That afternoon, I took a walk. Not for exercise, just to watch. And I started seeing it. Near the mailboxes, an older woman in yoga pants turned away as a compliance officer snapped a photo of her unzipped hoodie. By the playground, two teens stopped talking the moment a patrol cart rolled past. And at the far end of the East Trail, I saw Noam Bexley, the HOA's unofficial photographer, kneeling in the bushes, long lens camera in hand, aiming it toward a family with toddlers near the duck pond. He didn't look proud. He looked tired. I ducked behind a hedge and watched for another 10 minutes. Noam didn't move aggressively, didn't harass anyone, but he didn't look up from that lens either. On the walk back, I stopped by the bulletin again. Someone had scribbled a question in red pen across the bottom of the notice. When was this voted on? By sunset, it had been scrubbed clean. Later that evening, I asked Isolde if she'd ever seen an HOA successfully implement behavioral standards like this without a vote. No, she said. And if they did, it wouldn't hold. It's an ultra-vires act, beyond the legal power of the board. It's voidable. Could be a strong basis for injunctive relief. She was already drafting a preliminary brief. I nodded. But my concern wasn't just the policy. It was the pattern. It wasn't just CALA. It was quiet conditioning, visual intimidation, residents being watched, documented, then labeled as violations. And no one spoke, because no one wanted to be next. That night, I opened a shared folder Isolde had created, titled Standards Authority Review. Inside, she was already logging precedent cases, ratification timelines, and board signature histories. My part was clear. I needed to trace the pattern of abuse, how long it had gone on, who had been targeted, whether anyone else had tried to push back and failed. I didn't have subpoena power or a badge, but I had something Varela didn't expect: memory, witnesses, and a daughter who deserved a father who didn't blink when authority got sloppy. I clicked open a blank file. Known incidents of HOA conduct enforcement irregularities, Byford Trace. And I started typing. I found Noam Bexley behind the equipment shed at the edge of the East Trail, the place where hoses coiled like sleeping snakes, and the smell of fertilizer clung to everything. He was checking a tire on the patrol cart, hands shaking just enough to notice if you knew what to look for. "Didn't expect company," he said, not meeting my eyes. "I didn't expect to see a camera pointed at kids yesterday," I said. He flinched. The wrench slipped, clanged against the concrete, and he crouched to pick it up like the sound had hurt him. Noam had been around Byford Trace longer than almost anyone. Former photojournalist, Vietnam-era protest coverage, awards he never mentioned. Now he wore a faded HOA polo and did what Varela told him to do: capture, catalog, keep quiet. "I don't choose the assignments," he said. "I just document." "That's what everyone says," I replied, "until it's their kid." He looked past me, toward the trees, where the trail dipped out of sight. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The shed hummed with insects and the distant whine of a leaf blower. "She crossed a line," he said, finally. "Yesterday." I waited. "She told me to stay wide," he continued. "Frame the gazebo, get faces if possible. She said it would help the committee understand the seriousness." My jaw tightened. "You knew she was going after a minor." "I knew," he said, "and I hated it." He rubbed his temples, smearing grease into his hair. "I told her it wasn't right. She said the bylaws don't care about feelings. They care about process," I said. "And she skipped it." That got his attention. He straightened, eyes sharp now, professional instincts waking up. "Skipped what?" he asked. "The vote," I said. "The filing, the authority." He exhaled, slow and heavy. I figured. He told me about the spring, about the emergency meetings during the pandemic, how Varela pushed through updates under the banner of safety, how minutes were circulated late, how objections disappeared between drafts, how he'd been instructed to replace older photos in the archive with new ones, dated differently. "That's falsification," I said. "It's curation," he corrected, bitter. "That's what she calls it." Noam sank onto a milk crate. His shoulders sagged, years pressing down all at once. "I keep thinking if I don't do it, someone worse will, someone who won't hesitate." "Or," I said, "someone who won't document at all." He looked up at me then, really looked. "You're not here to yell at me." "No," I said. "I'm here to ask you what you saw." He hesitated. The internal war was visible, etched into the lines around his mouth. Loyalty versus decency. Paycheck versus sleep. "I saw a woman abuse her position," he said quietly. "And I pressed the shutter anyway." The words landed between us, heavy. "I can't give you files," he added quickly. "Not yet." "I didn't ask for files," I said. "I asked for truth." He nodded, a small motion, but it mattered. "If this goes public," he said, "she'll say I acted alone." "That's why timing matters," I replied. We stood there as the sun dipped, shadows stretching long across the concrete. When I turned to leave, he spoke again. "Dr. Maris," he said, "if you challenge her authority, she'll escalate." "I know," I said. "And if you're right about the standing," he continued, "everything she's done collapses." I met his eyes. "That's the point." As I walked away, I heard the camera case snap shut, not locked, just closed. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. 3 days after the gazebo incident, I opened our mailbox to find a thick envelope sealed with the HOA's crimson insignia. I didn't bring it inside. I read it right there, under the shade of the wrought iron trellis. Notice of conduct citation, Category 3, violation, accused of failure to maintain acceptable attire within shared recreational spaces. Assigned to Calla Maris, resident minor. Penalty, 125 fine. Repeat infraction to result in mandatory hearing and suspension of shared amenity privileges for household. She didn't even try to mask it. Varela had written the violation in the same cadence she used at board meetings, cold, ceremonial, drenched in false neutrality. I flipped the last page. A separate note was clipped to it. "Dr. Maris, if you have concerns about enforcement clarity, please attend our emergency board vote Friday evening. Community input is always welcome." Community input, right? I handed the envelope to Isolde when I stepped inside. She was already at the dining table, laptop open, papers spread out like wings. She read the citation without speaking, then held it up to the sunlight and checked the watermark. "No timestamp. That makes it legally challengeable," she said flatly. "But the meeting? She's going to try to ratify that clause officially, isn't she?" "Friday, 6 Isolde nodded. "Then we stop it before that happens. If it gets passed under a proper vote, her authority solidifies, and we lose standing to dispute enforcement already in play." I sat down across from her. "You said she skipped ratification before." "She did. The spring 2020 amendments, no vote, no record of public posting, and she filed it with the wrong timestamp at the county office. It was submitted as a deferred provisional clause, which doesn't exist under our HOA charter." Isolde leaned back, folding her arms. She built a sandcastle and convinced everyone it was stone. That night, I returned to my folder. Calla hadn't said much during dinner. She gave me a side hug and went upstairs without finishing her juice. But the silence wasn't just sadness now. It was insulation. She was protecting herself from the idea that adults like Varela could humiliate her and get away with it, and that couldn't be the lesson. I logged 3 more resident reports. One was a mother whose son had been cited for excessive loitering near the pool when he was waiting for her. Another mentioned an HOA complaint filed after a teenager wore a pride pin during the holiday parade. And one came from a father I barely knew. His email simply said, "If you're building a case, my daughter was told not to wear leggings on her morning run. That was 3 weeks ago." The pattern was obvious, but it wouldn't matter unless I proved Varela had no legal ground to enforce any of it. On Thursday afternoon, I took a walk to the far end of Byford Trace. Not the pretty parts, the fringe trails that loop behind the old tennis courts, where the creek curved inward and fewer homes stood. That's where I found the faded signpost for the HOA Amendment Archive, A weatherproof glass box barely taller than my waist, bolted into stone. Inside were 3 laminated notices, each dated before 2019. Nothing recent, no emergency clauses, no visual standards, no posted updates. It was required by our community. Charter that any resident-facing policy change be displayed here within 10 business days of ratification. Nothing had been posted in 4 years. I took photos, date-stamped them, checked the bolt seal tags, each one intact and untouched. If Varela wanted her new standards to have power, they needed roots, legitimacy, history. But all she had was a vacant frame and invisible ink. I returned home to find Isolde printing out HOA incorporation documents. She looked up at me and smiled, not warm but sharp, focused. "She doesn't realize it yet," she said, "but she's already lost." Friday morning, the sky broke open with a hard, steady rain. I took it as a sign, cleansing maybe, or just an omen that something was about to shift. The vote was only hours away, and Varela hadn't backed down. In fact, she'd doubled down. The HOA newsletter went out at 6 a.m., sharp. Subject line, "Upholding our standards, protecting our community." I read it twice. She'd framed the vote not as a formality, but as a defense against a vocal minority attempting to weaken our shared values. There were no names, but the implication couldn't have been clearer. I was the minority, and my daughter was the threat. I forwarded it to Isolde without a word. She called 2 minutes later. "She's overreaching in writing. That newsletter makes this personal," she said. "She's connecting policy to individual enforcement. That gives us leverage. Enough to stop the vote? No, but enough to challenge the authority of those casting it." I met her at her office an hour later. She was already in litigation mode, hair tied back, briefcase open, piles of annotated documents sorted by tags and tabs. "I dug into the amendment process," she said, sliding a packet across the desk to me. "You're not going to believe this." The top page was a scanned memo, dated March 2020. Subject line, "Emergency Procedure Authorization for Temporary Conduct Adjustments." It was signed by Varela Denton alone. "No quorum," I said. "Worse," Isolde replied. "The bylaws prohibit unilateral decisions outside of disaster declarations. Pandemic or not, HOA emergency powers had to be certified by 2/3 board approval. She never had it. Did she try to file it anyway? Yes. But she used the term interim morality provision, which is nowhere in the charter or municipal registry. The county clerk tagged it as a placeholder and never logged it as enforceable. I shook my head slowly. "So she's been enforcing a non-existent rule for over 3 years. Isolde nodded. "Illegally, and every fine, every citation, every public shaming connected to it, all unenforceable. Worse than that, potentially actionable." We sat in silence for a moment. The rain rattled the windows like a distant stampede. "She's going to try to ratify it tonight," I said. "Legitimize it before anyone can look closer. That's why we're not going to stop her from calling the vote," Isolde said, her voice low. "We're going to let her walk straight into her own trap." She outlined the plan calmly and thoroughly. Her legal tone never cracked. We wouldn't disrupt. We wouldn't argue. We'd let her call the vote. Let her enforce her phantom clause one last time. And then, using the exact language in her newsletter, we'd challenge the standing of the enforcement, not the policy, but her power to apply it retroactively based on a never-ratified clause. The moment she acknowledged a violation had occurred before ratification, she'd admit to exceeding her authority. It wouldn't matter if she passed the vote. She would have already broken the structure that made her enforcement legal. That was the difference between outrage and strategy. Outrage made noise. Strategy cut the roots. I left the office with a thick folder in my hand. On top was a photo I'd taken myself the day before of the empty HOA amendment box, cobwebbed and sealed, 4 years untouched. No posted clause, no ratified change, no authority. Just a glass case full of silence. I stopped at Rowan Green on the way home. The benches were slick from rain, the gazebo floor puddled with wind-blown leaves. It looked empty, cold, but I stood there anyway. This was where she tried to break my daughter, where she stood tall with a clipboard and a plastic badge and pretended it gave her power. Tonight, she'd learned the difference between intimidation and legitimacy, and when it was over, She wouldn't even be able to fine us for it. Calla came downstairs just after 5. She didn't say much, just stood there in the hallway, clutching a hoodie too big for her, watching me like she was still deciding if I'd keep my promise. I set the folder down on the counter and met her eyes. "You're not going," I said gently. "You don't need to be anywhere near that meeting." "I know," she whispered, "but if she does it again to someone else—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. That thought had been following me like a shadow since the day it happened. I walked over and knelt in front of her. "This isn't just about you anymore. It started there. But tonight, it's about all of us. And I swear to you, we're not letting her write the rules around your shame." Calla gave a small nod. It wasn't resolution, not yet. But it was belief. Enough for me to carry into that meeting. By the time I arrived, the rain had stopped. The clouds still hung low, heavy and dim. But the walk to the clubhouse was quiet. Hollow, like the storm had drained the air of its pretense. Inside, rows of folding chairs lined the community room. The front row had been reserved for board members, each name printed on laminated cards. Only 3 of them had shown up. Varela Denton was already seated at the center table, her papers arranged with military precision. She wore a deep burgundy blazer, pin, arm on the lapel, and that ever-present air of benevolent authority. She looked up as I entered. "Dr. Maris," she said smoothly, "nice of you to join us." I gave her a nod and took my seat 3 rows back. Isolde followed seconds later, dressed in her quiet courtroom gray. No makeup, no theatrics, just intent. More residents trickled in, fewer than I'd hoped, but more than I'd expected. Some looked tired, some looked resigned, but a few had that same edge in their gaze that I'd carried all week. The meeting opened like all the others. Approval of previous minutes, budget surplus, landscaping delays. Then Varela tapped her pen twice, a soft click that silenced the room. "Next item," she said, adjusting her posture. "Motion to formally ratify Article 3, Section 9, Visual Conduct Standards, originally proposed as a temporary clause during emergency conditions. The language will now be submitted as permanent enforceable policy." A murmur moved through the chairs. Someone near the back shifted uncomfortably. Before anyone could speak, she continued, "This is simply a formality to ensure clarity and consistency for all residents. There's no new language, just codifying what's already understood." Noam Bexley entered quietly through the side door. He stood near the wall, arms crossed, camera hanging from his shoulder, eyes fixed on the front. Isolde stood. "I have a question for the board," she said. Varela didn't hide her annoyance. "This is a vote, not a Q&A session." "It pertains to enforcement," Isolde said. "Surely the board is prepared to stand behind the legal basis of its citations." Varela blinked, a flicker of hesitation. "We've acted under the assumption that the clause was effectively provisional." "Provisional clauses," Isolde said, "do not authorize enforcement actions. So, I'd like clarification. Was the conduct citation issued to my daughter under a ratified policy or an assumed authority?" The room fell still. Varela opened her mouth, closed it, then shifted in her seat. "It was based on precedent." "Precedent," Isolde repeated. "Not ratification?" No one answered. She stepped forward and placed a document on the front table. "This is a time-stamped photo of the Community Amendment Archive. As of yesterday, no changes to Article 3 have been posted since 2019. She laid down a second page. "And this is the county office rejection slip for the so-called interim morality provision. It was never registered, never recognized, and therefore never enforceable." Varela's fingers tightened around her pen. Isolde smiled, small and cold. "You can vote tonight if you want, but it won't undo what's already been done. Every action taken under that ghost clause, void. Every fine, every threat, every humiliation, illegitimate. And the record now reflects that. I didn't need to look around to know people were listening differently now. The meeting wasn't over, but Varela's control was. Noam was waiting outside when the meeting ended. He hadn't taken a single photo during the vote. The camera hung from his shoulder like a vestigial limb, something he no longer knew how to use. I caught his eye through the crowd. He gave me a nod, not casual, not performative, just solid, like steel cooling into shape. Residents filtered out slowly. No one was talking loudly. There was a strange quiet in the air, like the first breath after a fire alarm ends. Varela stayed seated at the front of the room, staring at nothing. One of the other board members leaned in to speak with her, but she didn't respond. Isolde and I stood off to the side near the water table, letting people pass. We hadn't won yet, but something had shifted. You could feel it in the way people looked at us now, some with curiosity, some with cautious approval. But the fear was cracking. Noam approached, shoulders square. "She won't step down, not yet." "I know," I said. "She'll pretend nothing happened, try to outweigh the fallout." "She's going to call me in," he said. "Ask what I know, what I said." "You don't have to protect us?" He shook his head. "I'm not protecting you, I'm protecting my name." We walked together along the edge of the clubhouse lawn, where the grass had puddled from the earlier rain. The ground squelched under our shoes. "I've been complicit for too long," Noam said. "I told myself I was just doing a job, documenting what they asked, not interpreting, not deciding." "You were documenting injustice." He looked down at his hands. "And printing it with time stamps." He reached into his pocket and handed me a flash drive, black, small, unlabeled. I held it without speaking. "It's every incident she asked me to photograph in the past 18 months, he said. I sorted the metadata, time, date, who was targeted. "You'll see the patterns." I glanced at it. "You're sure?" "I'm tired of being afraid of someone who doesn't even follow her own rules." Noam exhaled and looked back at the clubhouse, then at me. "But you should know, she's not acting alone. She has allies, quiet ones, board members who don't speak but vote exactly how she tells them to. The treasurer, for one, he helped push the amendment filings through the clerk's office." "Under what authority?" "He said they were emergency record redundancies." The clerk never checked. I felt a chill settle under my skin. Isolde had warned this could go deeper, but hearing it from someone inside made it real. "I can testify," Noam said. "If this becomes legal, if there's a hearing, I'll say what I saw, what I was asked to do." "That won't be easy." "I'm not expecting easy, just overdue." We shook hands. His grip was firm, but there was a tremor beneath it. Not fear, just the weight of consequence. Back at home, I opened the flash drive in our study while Isolde updated her case notes. The files were meticulous. Each image was logged by location, date, and subject. Every folder marked by incident type: attire, language, body posture, hair color. That last one stopped me. Hair color. I opened it and found over a dozen photos of teenagers, most of them girls, all with dyed hair. Red streaks, blue ends, green roots, all taken in common areas. Mailboxes, sidewalks, pool gates. None of the boys were photographed, not once. It wasn't a policy enforcement pattern. It was a pattern of control. I cross-checked one of the file tags with the HOA newsletter from 6 months ago. Concerns of visual disruptions during youth gatherings. Varela had cited decorum risks without naming specifics. Now I had specifics. Now I had dates. And thanks to Noam, I had a witness. Isolde looked up from her laptop. "That's everything we need to move to phase 2. I nodded, not because I was ready, but because there was no turning back. We started the next morning at 6:30 sharp. Isolde laid out a timeline on the dining table, white legal paper taped end to end like a forensic map. Each incident we'd traced from Noam's archive was marked with a red dot, each confirmed citation under the fake clause with a black one. By the time we finished, the pattern wasn't just visible, it was undeniable. "This isn't enforcement," she said. "It's profiling. Hair color, shirt slogans, visible piercings, LGBTQ+ symbols. Nearly every target had been a teen, and nearly every teen had been female. She was building a moral template, and no one had stopped her." Isolde circled 3 key dates in the middle of the timeline. "These are our entry points. First, the March 2020 memo with the fake clause. Second, the falsified filing date. Third, the newsletter where she acknowledges pre-ratification enforcement. If we pull the right thread..." "She doesn't just lose authority," Isolde said. "She retroactively invalidates every punitive action tied to this clause. That includes our citation, and anyone else's." We each took a section of the plan. I went to work on the community side, building a quiet list of parents whose children had been targeted, cited, or verbally warned. I didn't ask for complaints. I asked for moments, small, strange moments when something didn't feel right. An odd warning, a cold conversation, a citation that didn't make sense. Within 48 hours, I had 16 responses. One mother wrote, "I didn't know anyone else went through this. I thought it was just us." Another said, "My daughter stopped using the clubhouse gym because she was told her shorts were distracting. She was wearing basketball gear." Each story added to the mountain. Not just legal misconduct, psychological harm, emotional erosion by slow attrition. Isolde, meanwhile, dug through HOA filings with surgical precision. She printed every procedural requirement in the Byford Trace Charter. One clause stood out. No bylaw or policy shall be applied retroactively unless such intent is stated at time of vote and clearly posted in all resident-facing materials. It wasn't just a line. It was a legal firewall. Varela had never included such language in her filings. Her enforcement had all been conducted under the pretense that the rule had always existed, but she never claimed retroactivity, meaning every action she took before the vote was not just wrong, it was indefensible. On Wednesday, we met at a law office off the main road, neutral ground, with a partner Isolde had known since her early days in litigation. His name was Elliot Sorn, an expert in HOA procedural collapses and standing revocations. He read everything silently, flipping pages without comment. When he was done, he looked up. "You don't need to file anything yet," he said. "If you present this to the right residents first, they'll demand her removal themselves. This is the kind of thing that creates open revolt, if people understand it." "What about the board?" I asked. "They're exposed too, but they'll do what people in power always do. Deny knowledge. You only need one to flip." We already had Noam. That made two. Isolde slid a second folder across the table. Inside were printed statements from 4 other parents, signed and notarized. Each described their child's incident and included a date and digital copy of the citation. Sorn raised an eyebrow. "Well then, you're not just building a case, you're building a coup." That night, we updated the map. The red and black dots had become clusters, clear focal points where enforcement had ramped up. Around the pool deck, the basketball courts, the outer trail, always spaces where teens gathered, never where board members walked. Calla watched us from the hallway. She didn't say anything, but her eyes stayed on the photos, on the map, on the proof that it hadn't just been her. "You're going to stop her?" she asked finally. Isolde didn't even look up. "We already have. She just doesn't know it yet." By Thursday afternoon, we had everything: legal foundation, witness support, parental testimony, and the digital archive that exposed the scope of the abuse. But none of it would matter unless we moved deliberately. Not loud, not chaotic, just surgical. I spent the morning walking the perimeter of Byford Trace, hitting every side street where the houses curved away from the clubhouse, away from the curated illusion. I wasn't canvassing, I wasn't campaigning, I was planting anchors. At each house, I met with one resident, always a parent, always someone who'd written me quietly, nervously, people who had stayed silent too long. I brought them printouts, nothing confidential, nothing emotional, just dates, timelines, copies of the bylaws they never knew existed, and one simple question: would you be willing to speak just once, when it counts? Some said no, but enough said yes. Back home, Isolde printed final statements. We decided to submit everything through the community petition clause, buried deep in the charter, barely ever used. It allowed residents to call an emergency public vote for board censure if procedural fraud was confirmed by a minimum threshold of first-hand testimony. We passed that threshold at noon. Still, we knew Varela wouldn't fold at a petition. She would spin it, delay it, force it into bureaucratic tar. So, we built pressure the way systems fear most, from within. We reached out to a former board member who had quietly resigned 2 years ago after a sudden, unexplained conflict. His name was Warren Elliott. He lived 2 blocks over from us, near the side entrance no one used anymore. We'd never spoken before, but when I called and explained what we had, he didn't hesitate. "She did the same thing with the tree ordinance," he said. "Passed it on a voice vote when quorum was absent. That's why I left." Warren agreed to provide a sworn statement on past procedural manipulation. Different clause, same method. That gave us something rare, pattern of behavior, and the final piece came from Noam. He texted me that evening. Check your email. Final file set, organized by resident initials and location timestamps. Let me know if anything's missing. There was nothing missing. He'd uploaded everything. Even the internal email thread between him and the compliance coordinator, where Varela specifically asked him not to photograph board member, relatives, or well-known donor families. We didn't need that one to win, but it confirmed what we already knew. The next step wasn't legal. It was atmospheric. We made 2 posters, not flyers, posters. Clean, minimal, black text on white paper. Did the HOA cite your child for a rule that didn't legally exist? Friday, 6 p.m. Emergency public forum. Bring your story. Bring your name. Bring your line in the sand. We placed one on the clubhouse door, the other at the outer walking trail where most teens gathered. We didn't say who organized it. We didn't have to. By now, the neighborhood already knew where the center of the resistance was forming. That night, I watched Kala place her original t-shirt into a shadow box frame, the one from the charity run, still stained from sweat, still wrinkled. She hung it on her wall above her bookshelf. Is this for me or for her? I asked. She looked at it for a long time before answering. It's for what comes after. I stood in the doorway watching her. She wasn't the same girl who had frozen at the gazebo. She wasn't waiting for someone to defend her anymore. She was watching us make it right. And tomorrow, the entire neighborhood would get a chance to decide which side of that line they stood on. By the time we reached the clubhouse on Friday evening, the energy had shifted. People weren't lingering outside, waiting for someone else to speak first. They came with folders, folded notes, even manila envelopes. Some came alone, others brought their kids. Word had spread fast. Inside, the usual tight rows of chairs had been rearranged into a wide circle. Whether that was intentional or a board member's idea of control, I didn't know. But it made the room feel like a trial without a judge, just the community staring at itself. Varela sat in her usual place at the front. Burgundy again, clipboard again, expression unreadable. But this time, her board members didn't line up behind her. Only one sat nearby. The others kept to the edges, like they were hedging their bets. At 6:03, she stood. This emergency forum, she began, has been called under Article 4, Section 2 of the HOA Charter, which permits residents to raise grievances provided they do so respectfully, without slander, and within the allotted time. Her tone was tight, scripted. As such, we will allow 1 minute per speaker. Please form a line. I'll go first, said a voice near the back. It was Warren Elliott. He stepped forward and placed a printed statement on the table in front of her. This is my account of board procedural violations I witnessed during my tenure. You can log it into the minutes. Then he turned, faced the room, and said, You all should know. She did this before. Different rule, same trick. A few people clapped, soft, cautious. Next came a woman I hadn't spoken to. Lena, I remembered from one of the emails. She held up a photo of her daughter. This is Karina. She got her first violation at 12 years old for wearing a headscarf at the pool. There's no rule against it, but we paid the fine because we were scared. One by one, they kept coming. A father of 3. A teenager who hadn't spoken until now. A mother whose son was stopped at the gate by compliance staff and asked to remove a rainbow patch from his backpack. Each voice layered atop the next, and the room began to shift. Not in volume, but in weight. The kind of weight you feel when truth becomes too thick to ignore. I stood near the center, waiting. Watching Varela, her pen moved occasionally, but she didn't speak. Her eyes didn't leave the paper until the 12th speaker approached the front. It was Noam. He carried nothing in his hands, just the same camera around his shoulder. But this time, it stayed off. He cleared his throat, looked straight at her. You asked me to document violations, he said. But you never asked me to document yours. Silence. I was part of it. I admit that. I took the photos, I logged the timestamps. But I've also submitted a sworn statement confirming that the clause you cited was never voted on, never filed correctly, and never made public until it was used to punish people. He turned to the room. If that's not abuse of authority, I don't know what is. When he stepped back, I walked forward. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't wave papers. I just placed one final document on the table, a notarized request for board censure under the HOA's own disciplinary provision. It had 17 signatures. Varela looked at it, then looked at me. "You've built quite a campaign," she said, voice cool. "No," I said. "You did. We just documented it better." She leaned back in her chair, hands folded now. No pen, no rebuttal. The room didn't erupt. There were no cheers, no shouting. Just a quiet, undeniable realization settling across every person in attendance. She wasn't in control anymore. The following Monday, a notice appeared on the HOA portal under the Community Announcements tab. Board restructuring vote, urgent special session scheduled. No signature, no elaboration, just a date, Friday, 7 p.m. Isolde printed it immediately, circled the time with a red marker, and slid it across the table toward me. "She's trying to buy time," she said. "If she resigns before the vote, she controls the narrative. If she waits too long, she risks being removed publicly." "She'll show up," I said. "She'll count on the old guard to back her." "And they won't," Isolde replied. "Not this time." The days between moved quietly. No new citations were issued. No patrols rolled through the walking paths. Even the bulletin board by the pool remained untouched. It was as if the system had paused, holding its breath. But the silence didn't slow us. We finalized the materials, copies of the invalid filing, the failure to post, the prior board member's testimony, Noam's folder of images, and the dozen written statements collected from residents, each one notarized, each one tied to a timeline. We didn't need drama. We needed clarity. Friday arrived hot and windless, the kind of evening that made the air feel heavy with decision. The clubhouse parking lot filled early. I stood by the sidewalk and counted cars. By 6:45, every seat in the main room was full. Some people stood along the back wall, arms crossed, silent. Others brought clipboards and pens like they'd been waiting for an excuse to finally take inventory of everything. Varela walked in at exactly 6:59. No clipboard, no blazer. She wore a plain gray blouse, sleeves rolled just once. She looked smaller. Not humbled, not apologetic, just condensed. Like a balloon deflated, but not yet removed from the string. She took her seat at the front, nodded once to the treasurer, and folded her hands on the table. The secretary called the session to order. "We've received a formal petition from residents requesting a vote on the removal of board chair Varela Denton," she said. "According to Article 6, Section 8 of our charter, such a vote may proceed if quorum is reached and no procedural objections are sustained." Varela raised her hand. "I have a procedural objection," she said calmly. "The evidence submitted has not undergone legal review." Isolde stood before the secretary could respond. "There is no requirement in the charter for external legal review prior to an internal vote," she said, "and the evidence was compiled from your own bylaws, your own filings, and your own emails." She placed a folder on the front table. "This is the complete packet. You're welcome to read it out loud." The secretary hesitated, opened the folder, and flipped through the pages. Each one bore dates, signatures, stamps. Each one told the same story. A policy invented, a vote skipped, citations issued under fake authority, residents intimidated, teens shamed, and finally, resistance. The treasurer asked the question, "All in favor of removal of Chair Varela Denton under Article 6, Section 8? Hands went up, not slowly, not cautiously, decisively. The count passed threshold in the first row alone. The vote was logged. The room held its breath. Varela stood. She didn't speak, didn't protest. She simply nodded once, to no one in particular, and walked out of the clubhouse without a glance behind her. No applause followed. This wasn't a victory anyone celebrated with noise. It was one of those endings that sounded like air returning to a sealed room, slow, invisible, undeniable. The board would elect a new chair the following week. But that night, for the first time in years, the residents of Byford Trace lingered in the clubhouse after the meeting. They spoke to each other. They asked questions. They looked around like the place finally belonged to them again. I found Calla standing just outside the door, hands in her hoodie pocket, staring at the gravel path lit by the clubhouse lanterns. "She's gone?" she asked. "She's done," I said. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. She just kept watching the light. The next morning, Rowan Green felt different. Not brighter, not louder, just honest again. The kind of honesty that comes after something false has finally been torn down. The gravel path was still damp from last night's sprinkler cycle, and the gazebo wood smelled faintly of pine. For the first time since the incident, the place didn't feel like a scar. Calla walked beside me, hands tucked into her sleeves. She wasn't rushing, she wasn't shrinking into herself the way she used to around this spot. She just moved at her own pace, like the air didn't belong to someone else anymore. When we reached the center of the gazebo, she stopped and looked up at the beams. The morning sun filtered through the latticework, casting thin lines of light across her face. For a moment, neither of us said anything. It didn't feel like a place for words yet. "I thought I'd always remember that day when I looked at this," she said finally. "But now it just feels neutral, like it's not hers anymore." "It never was," I said. "She just acted like it." Calla leaned against the railing. "Is it over?" "Yes," I said. "But the part that matters most, that starts now." Because the truth wasn't just that we'd removed her. It was that we'd redefined what this community tolerated, what it allowed to stand, what it allowed to happen in silence. That was always the real battle, getting people to peel back their fear long enough to see that they had power. When we returned home, the HOA portal had already updated. Interim board chair, appointed pending election. Visual conduct standard removed from charter. Community review of enforcement practices scheduled. A full erasure of her legacy. And then, later that afternoon, a message appeared in my inbox from Noam. "I resigned, full statement attached, thank you for letting me repair something I helped break." He wasn't running, he was owning it, and in some ways, that mattered even more than anything we had done. The new interim chair, a soft-spoken retired school principal named Aldora Venn, requested a meeting with me and Isolde that same evening. We sat at the long oak table in the clubhouse while she listened without interrupting. Every detail, every incident, every way the system had been bent until it snapped. When we finished, she nodded slowly. "People shouldn't have to be brave to feel safe," she said. "That's where we start." Over the next week, the neighborhood felt lighter. Teens walked with headphones without being followed. Parents lingered at the playground without glancing over their shoulders. Someone hung a small bouquet at the gazebo rail, wildflowers tied with twine. No note, no message. Just a quiet thank you to the space itself for surviving long enough to be reclaimed. One evening, I found Calla in her room, taping a new piece of paper to the shadow box where her charity t-shirt hung. It was a single-typed line. "I finished the run." She looked at me and smiled. Not the half smile she used when she was trying to reassure me. A real one, a rebuilt one. "You did," I said, "and everything after it." Outside, the neighborhood lights flickered on, one by one, warming the streets that had once felt icy with surveillance. We'd won more than a vote. We'd won the right to breathe. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with me through it. And before you go, I'd love to hear one thing in the comments. Where are you watching from today?